I'm always a little bit leery of compliments. Since a time when I was in Dallas and I made a speech, and a lady rushed up to the platform after I had finished, and she said, Professor Hanson, she said, that was just superfluous. And I said, well, thank you. I said, I was thinking of having it published posthumously. And she said, the sooner the better. I hope I can make this work now. This is the third time I've been invited to speak at this conference. And since I'm not a historian, I can only conclude that it's because I've become a relic of historical interest. The real interest of the day, of course, is the 40th anniversary of our Agricultural Reserve. And there seems to be, as Knight suggested, a general agreement that it's been a good thing. But 40 years is a short time. And as some great historian must have said when he was asked whether Athens or Rome had made the greatest contribution to civilization, he said, you know, it's too soon to tell. Therefore, with some apologies to Edward Bellamy, I'm going to ask you to indulge me in a thought experiment. Join me at an overlook on Sugarloaf Mountain in looking backward at the Agricultural Reserve at its centennial in 2080. Now, I've been sitting there on a boulder for over 50 years, watching over the Agricultural Reserve after the Montgomery Countryside Alliance dipped me in bronze. Now, although it's a great viewpoint, I'd actually not seen very much because I was clinically dead. Fortunately, however, they forgot to turn off my pacemaker. The bronze was not of very high quality, and it disintegrated when a wandering group of historians tossed a rock at some starlings who were roosting on me. And once we recovered our mutual shock, my rescuers came forward and I implored them to help me understand what had happened during the time that I had been inert, to help me interpret the landscape that lay before us. Luckily, they were able to do so because in 2020, the Montgomery County Historical Society had started a major research project on the Agricultural Reserve to chronicle its events, its associations of citizens, its politics, and its agricultural economy. The air was clean and clear. I could see the Washington Monument and the Capitol in the distance and the towers of Loudoun County across the Potomac. The rooftops below us glistened in the sunlight because by that time, Montgomery County had required all roofs to have solar panels, and they were organized in smart microgrids. Now, homes and buildings in the sanitary district were heated and cooled by their sewer, which provided thermal energy. In the 20s and 30s, there had been several ill-considered efforts to devote large areas of the Agricultural Reserve to generate solar energy. They were defeated as people realized it made little sense to deface a great resource for carbon sequestration and that there were better alternatives to using the reserve for impervious surface instead of carbon sequestration. The worst idea was one to devote 30,000 acres to a solar complex. But fortunately, this is Montgomery County. It was referred to an advisory committee, and all of the members died before they could reach consensus. Instead of using farmland, they used instead the old high voltage power line corridors and replaced them with solar panels. Now, fossil fuels were banned after 2050, and the old Dickerson power plant had become an art gallery, operated night by historic medley. Climate change had reduced winter to just a few weeks. Rainfall increased, especially during the July monsoon, which was followed by the annual 100-year drought. The Larry Hogan Memorial Tollway had been closed several decades ago, and the toll lanes were replaced by the Maglev Express and a hiker-biker trail from Hagerstown to Dulles by way of Rockville, Bethesda, Tysons, and Reston. The fire department, unfortunately, was still trying to widen rustic roads, but the money for it had pretty much dried up in the face of demands for more and better public transportation and for bike streets that were closed to automobiles. Hardly anyone nowadays in 2080 drives their electric autonomous vehicle to go to work because telecommuting and public transportation are ubiquitous. I asked my rescuers what had ever happened to the idea of a major highway cutting through the reserve and crossing the Potomac to connect the 270 corridor with Dulles Airport. Oh, they said, you mean the zombie highway? Well, they said, no, in the 60s, or up until the 60s, that proposal was resurrected about every 10 years to eat the minds of highway advocates until they realized they were sitting on a red-hot stove. And after the maglev was built, the idea basically went away. A trip from Germantown to Dulles now takes about 15 minutes. I was relieved to hear that the second crossing was no longer undead, but finally dead. We figured that when we amputated the leg of the Outer Beltway in 1974, it wasn't going to grow back. Now, I found all this news very reassuring because before my career as a bird roost, I'd been worried that the reserve might be frittered away by people professing to love it while promiscuously adding accessory uses to the zoning code that would ultimately make agriculture accessory to the accessories. So whatever happened to agritourism, I asked? He said, well, you know, there have been some real great successes, and some both operationally and financially, with things that actually were accessory to agriculture, like grape stomping and tasting rooms at wineries, a few breweries, some pick-your-own farms, and even some grow-your-own farms, and harvest and planting festivals. But some of the great big ideas had gone away a little bit like the megachurches and the expansive private facilities back in the 70s, because ultimately they couldn't compete with better and more convenient facilities in the growing cities of Germantown and Clarksburg. One of the great benefits of one of the craziest ideas was that the state had declared the reserve and similar areas elsewhere in the state areas of critical state concern, and had also provided loan assistance for new farmers entering the market. The most interesting proposal, they said, however, was one made during the recession of the 2060s that would have converted the entire agricultural reserve into a theme park with anatomically correct robotic cows that gave pasteurized, lactose-free soy milk, and most of all, emitted no methane. There were rides on plastic ponies, and there was even a funicular railway to the top of Sugarloaf Mountain where people could ride the Observe the Reserve Ferris wheel. And there were going to be hologram farmers and a 10,000-acre corn maze, the largest in the world, and even paintball games in Little Bennett and Black Hill Park. The advocates, of course, argued that these were important because it all would improve farmers' income and it would at last make the parks turn a profit. Now, this project failed ultimately because members of the council who had sponsored it realized at last that the plastic and the other elements were not, and the paint in the paintball course were not biodegradable. So, and what really killed it was that they finally realized that Sugarloaf Mountain is not actually in Montgomery County. Instead, they passed a resolution that declared the Ag Reserve to be Montgomery County's beloved Central Park. Now, my new friends then decided to take me on a tour of the reserve, and as our autonomous vehicle traveled from the mouth of Seneca around to Brookville, I noticed that mailboxes were all gone. They'd been replaced by Amazon drones, and many farm entrance signs still had the names of venerable families who had lived in the county for years and years, but there are also a lot of new signs with Hispanic and Asian and African names on them, which reflected the population of the county, which was now only about 25% white Anglo. Fields I remembered as rotating from year to year with corn and soy were now orchards, vineyards. They were growing hemp and table crops that were favored by Hispanic, Asian, and African palates. They pointed out the trend that had established in the first 40 years of the reserve had continued. Grain farming continued to decline, in part due to the idiotic tariff that had been enacted during the second Ivanka Trump administration, and the decline of the Delmarva chicken industry due to its impact on the Chesapeake Bay and the rising sea levels. There was also a good bit of soybean farming remaining. It basically supplied Germantown's tofu factory, which was the maker of the famous "I can't believe it's not chicken." The 10-month growing season allowed 2 crops a year, plus greenhouse and hydroponic farming during the 2 months of cool weather. Much of the food that was produced was sold at the Reserve Grand Farmers Market on the old fairgrounds in Gaithersburg. The reserves also still had a lot of horses that were valuable not only for recreation, but now that chemical fertilizers were either outlawed or had become prohibitively expensive, horse manure was a major cash crop. As we turned down Sugarland Road, the forensic anthropologist in the group asked if I knew what those large mounds were that were about 5 feet high and 30 feet long. She asked if they were evidence of some historic ancient mound builders or if they had some religious significance. No, I said, those are sand mounds. The 1980 plan recommended not using alternative septic technology in the reserve, but then the Maryland Environmental Department declared sand mounds to be conventional technology, and they began to be permitted, creating the potential for hundreds of additional houses that would exceed the carrying capacity of the natural soils of the area. But before I had been bronzed, I had worried that there might be just a proliferation of these, and that there would be a whole slew of McMansions all across the area. But I didn't see all that many as we traveled around, so I said, well, you know, either the council must have come to its senses and repealed the permission for sand mounds, or the BLT program is working well. BLT program? One of my rescuers asked, what does a bacon sandwich have to do with the reserve? There are just not a lot of hog farms out here. I said, well, when the reserve was created, we expected that when farmers sold their transferable development rights to builders, they might keep one for every 25 acres for an existing house or to build another one. But what we found out was that by 2006, the prices for those remaining development rights were selling for somewhere between $300,000 and $750,000 apiece. That made land out of reach for new farmers trying to enter the market. And it raised the prospect that a whole lot of land could be fragmented by little subdivisions. So we had unintentionally created a whole set of super rights. Real farmers began championing a program to make it as profitable to sell those super rights as to build on them. So the planning board worked through the mechanics and the economics of how that might work by requiring developers in transit-served areas to buy them to justify a percentage of the development that they were going to provide over and above a certain base that they can develop as a matter of right. This apparently had begun to work pretty well. I said, so it looks like also that the PIF policy has worked. Well, I had finally explained what a BLT was, and it wasn't edible. But they wondered now, what in the world was a PIF? I said, well, a PIF is basically a private institutional facility, which itself is a euphemism for megachurches and other gigantic outfits that attracted large numbers of people, generated high volumes of traffic on narrow country roads, and What happened was development rights were sold off the land. The land then became very available for people who wanted to move from an urban location that was tightly constricted to a campus facility in the reserve. Or, if they got lucky and a land-rich member passing through the eye of a needle decided to endow his association with the land, that made it available also. And so if one donated the land to a cause with an edifice complex, you could possibly get a real substantial operation going in the reserve. And in the early part of the 21st century, there were several of these proposals that were advanced. And until the county decided to make some changes in the septic regulations and in the zoning code, they were a real threat to the integrity of the reserve. But apparently the PIF worked, and now the PIFs had been poofed. Now, all things considered, I was very pleased that the reserve had survived. And just as I was remarking on how well kept its historic farmsteads were, we entered a time warp, and it was 2020 again. It was good to look backward, but what I saw was only one possible future. I realized how important it was to recognize that what we may see at some future day will be shaped by a series of but-fors, people and events without which something different would have happened. The hard question for history is not what happened, but why did it happen? Why wasn't Montgomery developed like the rest of the region? Why isn't there a metropolitan Poolesville? Why, in the age of suburban sprawl, did the reserve happen instead of what looked like was going to be inevitable in 1970? As I've thought about that question, here's what I think. The reserve would not have happened but for two brothers-in-law, a planter's thumb, 3 ironies, a power play, and 2 windows of opportunity. Now, since I'm talking to historians, I know that context matters. I've been accused in the past of trying to put context in context, so I'll try to be brief. As Montgomery County's agricultural economy shifted first from tobacco to grain and then to dairying when the B&O Metropolitan branch opened, and then back again to grain, soybeans, and pumpkins. We are the largest producer of pumpkins of any county in the state. We have to be proud of what we can be proud. Civilization, in the meantime, followed the sewer. The county's population grew tenfold between 1920 and 1950, but almost half the county at that time was still rural. An early effort was made to keep that part of the county rural when a lame duck council approved the idea of 10-acre zoning, but it never got around to implementing the idea, and the next council just rezoned part of it 2-acre and left the rest of the up-county zoned half-acre. just waiting for sewer. About this time, however, there was a nationwide concern that rapid growth was going to overwhelm the area, metropolitan areas. And in this area, there was concern that it was going to even impair the efficient operation of the federal government. And everyone knows how important the efficient operation of the federal government is. So the National Capital Regional Planning Council produced a plan for the year 2000, which recommended organizing the region's growth in compact new cities along radial highway corridors, separated by wedges of open space. The Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission hired consultant Harlan Bartholomew to prepare the 1962 Wedges and Corridors Plan. Landowners, developers, business people denounced it, and a few months later, Montgomery County elected a county council that was opposed to it and merrily set about rezoning everything that it couldn't move for the next 4 years. The brothers-in-law saved it. David Scull, as chairman of the Republican Central Committee, got Caroline Freeland appointed to the Montgomery County Planning Board. And Blair Lee III, who was a bridge between the old guard of his father's political machine and the new rising reform wing of the Democratic Party, joined Scull in persuading the Planning Commission to come up with a compromise that it could adopt. When the commission deadlocked on the density for the wedges, a planner's thumb made adoption possible. Planner Lewis Elston prepared the plan's land use map using pastels instead of ink and smearing the colors with his thumb to make the wedge densities ambiguous. His low-tech cartography allowed planning commissioners to interpret the wedges as they saw fit, and the commission happily adopted the plan in 1964. That was the first irony that would make the Agricultural Reserve eventually possible. Because Colonel Lee had blocked the reformers' efforts, led in part by Knight's father, Austin, to abolish the Planning Commission, the Planning Commission still had authority to adopt the plan, and the council could do nothing about it except ignore it, which they did. Now, once more, Scull and Lee played critical roles in rescuing it. In 1966, a new council was elected, comprised of 3 Democrats and 4 Republicans, one of whom was David Scull. The Republicans couldn't agree on who should be the first president of the council. So Scull made a deal with the Democrats. He would become the first president, and the Democrats would then follow him for the next 3 years. The bipartisan majority now then set up an advisory committee to decide whether or not the general plan still had validity and could be adopted, because in the meantime, Blair Lee, a state senator, had gotten legislation passed to allow the council to approve master plans, and once they did it, the commission had to adopt what the council approved. In setting up an advisory committee, they chose Blair Lee to be the chairman of the committee, and the Lee committee then recommended that the Wedges and Corridors plan was still viable. It should be amended and updated and adopted by or approved by the council and adopted by the commission, which then happened. I think I've got one more here somewhere. Yeah, I've gone too fast. That's all right. In 1970, a new council was elected. But we had a new charter, and we had a divided government. We had an all-Democratic council and a Republican executive, Jim Gleason. The council members had been elected on promising to implement the general plan. Gleason was not so sure. So they entered in, the real issue was who was going to control the planning board. Under the new charter, Gleason had the appointment power. The council wanted the appointment power, and they had a several-month battle about it. Finally, the council won. The legislative delegation gave them the power to appoint the board. By 1972, they had a new board in place, and began to work on implementing of the general plan. Now, this was complicated by the fact that no sooner had they taken office than most of the county was under a moratorium against building with any new sewer connections. So that placed pressure on the wedges, because while developers couldn't operate down county, they could build in the wedges where you could use well and septic. So desperately seeking relief from the sewer moratorium, the Washington Suburban Sanitary Commission and the county executive proposed a 65 million gallon a day wastewater treatment plant to treat Montgomery County's sewage. Prince George's County, which is downstream, refused to accept it. It didn't want to be the sewer capital of the world. So they had to find a place in Montgomery County. They had to find a place that was above the water intakes of the Sanitary Commission. Most of all, they had to find a place where there weren't active neighborhood associations around it. And they decided on Dickerson, which is as far from the water intakes as you can get and still be in Montgomery County. Now, that required, because Dickerson is 100 feet higher than the Beltway, it required a force main to take sewage for 25 miles from the Beltway to Dickerson, which threatened the viability of the western wedge, because if you got a big trunk sewer going through it, it's an invitation to hook on as many places as you can, and since there was half-acre zoning out there, it seemed like a real possibility. Now we come to the first window of opportunity. Our planning director at the time, Dick Tustin, who was deeply committed to implementing the general plan, realized that a sewer provided an opportunity to save the wedge instead of destroy it, and to implement the general plan by putting in place a rural zone which had been recommended by the general plan. And a team led by planner Perry Berman methodically identified every property that would be appropriate to put into that zone. And ultimately, the council applied it to about 113,000 acres, of which 96,500 were placed in the rural zone. It also restricted access to the proposed force main to Germantown and Gaithersburg. But ultimately, the EPA denied approval for the Dickerson plant. But without that sewer situation and the window of opportunity it opened, it's quite possible in the hectic pace of business in those days, we would not have paid the attention that we did to the wedge. But in spite of the rural zone, homes continued to be developed in the reserve, or in the wedge, on septics. Suburbanization seemed inevitable, and what we called an impermanence syndrome began to set in, and across the nation now, there was growing interest in doing something about protecting farmland. So, and even in Montgomery County, we were a little fortunate because corn and soybean prices spiked at about this time, and people were more interested in saving their farms than in selling for development. The county, again, this being Montgomery County, appointed an advisory committee of farmers to work with the planning board to figure out what to do. And we began to develop ideas and ultimately came up with the Functional Master Plan for Preservation of Agriculture and Rural Open Space, the beginnings of the Agricultural Reserve. The plan had three critical elements. First was identifying a critical mass of contiguous farmland that could and should be protected. And second was devising a zone that provided a reasonable density for residences and provided a minimum acreage that would be possible for a profitable farm, which we decided was 25 acres. And finally, providing some way to deal with the equity that farmers had in their land. The plan identified about 110,000 acres containing the critical mass of farmland and rural villages, and a smaller 26,000 acre area that had already been too fragmented to protect for agriculture, but could be protected for open space. The third irony was that New York City's Grand Central Station provided the solution for the equity problem for farmers in the Agricultural Reserve. The Supreme Court had recently held that to protect Grand Central Station, it could transfer the development rights that it had under its zoning to adjacent property in order to save the station. So adapting the idea of these transferable development rights for agricultural preservation involved two basic innovations. Landowners in the new zone could retain one development right for each 5 acres, which they could then send, and I hope this is all coordinated, they could send by having a builder purchase them who had land in an area that was suited for development and zoned to accept the additional density. If they were purchased then, the farmers were able to recover the equity that they had in the land and keep the land, and we could have higher density in areas that were actually suited for it. And that's sort of how it worked. Thus, we had established the reserve. Many of the farmers were a little bit leery of this, but we had convinced them, I think, that the council was prepared to adopt a 25-acre zone without TDRs, so the then president of the Farm Bureau told me that we had made him an offer that he couldn't refuse. The final touch, thanks for identifying me as the godfather. The final touch was to give it a name, the Agricultural Reserve, which we chose because it distinguished the area from one that was preserved to one that was reserved for active agriculture, rather than just being ill-defined open space. It worked. The reserve has become a national model. And now about 75,000 acres are in either TDR or other easements in perpetuity. Only a few TDRs remain on the land to be sold. The selling price has varied with the housing market, starting at under $10,000, reaching $42,000 apiece in 2006, crashing during the Great Recession, and now rising back into the 20,000s. The reserve has been honored by the American Planning Association as a national planning landmark. In 2017, in the agricultural census, it contained 558 farms and 350 horticultural businesses. It provided only over 10,000 jobs and $250 million a year in income. I don't actually know what the reserve will look like in 2080. I assume that you thought I did. But there are some things I do know. I know that if the county enforces its easements in perpetuity, the land can be protected so that it can be used for agriculture and not preempted for unrelated and invasive uses. I know that as the region continues to grow, the reserve will add value to the quality of life for residents and businesses. It not only marks Montgomery as environmentally unique, it is an inspiring and beautiful complement to our great park system. With its rustic roads and historic sites, it is a landscape for bikers, hikers, equestrians, and environmentalists to explore and cherish. For the county's residents, or for the county's students, rather, it's a living ecology curriculum. For historians, it has events to chronicle, structures, families, and communities to interpret, and secrets to reveal. I know that most of all, the reserve is and will be a source of fresh local food and of fiber. The kind of farming done in the reserve will change because agriculture is the most sensitive of industries to consumer demand and tastes. What is produced, how it is grown, and by whom, and the size of farms will be in almost constant flux. One of the great challenges to perpetuation of farming is facilitating the entry of new generations of farmers, particularly by enabling them to purchase or lease farms by keeping land values within reach. Development of a central farmers market could not only provide quality products for local palates, it could be an educational force for healthy living and build strong emotional and financial bonds between the reserve and consumers as the county becomes increasingly urban and diverse. We can hope the reserve will remain a working landscape, changing in ways that we cannot now imagine. The greatest danger to its integrity will come from well-meaning but poorly thought-through policies that fragment it with ex-urban subdivisions or that introduce invasive uses alien to its purpose that would turn it from a working landscape to a passive one or some kind of theme park. The survival and integrity of the reserve rests on broader understanding by the public and policymakers that it is a vital part of the county's economy, of the regional environment, and of its recreational and cultural ecosystem. Our county and state officials should heed Hippocrates. First, do no harm. And second, think before you act. Now, I've dealt thus far primarily on utilitarian justifications for the reserve. There is, however, a deeper moral reason for sustaining it so that it will be here in 2080 and in 2180 and every 100 years after that. An urban, knowledge-based civilization has many advantages, but one of its disadvantages is loss of a connection with Mother Earth. The reserve is an immediate reminder that there is a season for planting, and one for growing, and one for harvest, and one for letting the earth rest before the next cycle of life begins anew. For all of us, it is a public trust to pass to future generations in better shape than we received it. This little patch of dirt is not magnificent in the great scheme of things, but alone in this metropolis, in the midst of constant change and development, it is an intentional garden, guarded by law, rooted in history, a private place that serves a public interest. In this urban and global age, such a garden is more important than ever. It is a physical symbol and moral recognition of humanity's inseparable connection with the earth, which is so easily dismissed as we move from farm to industry to the virtual world of artificial intelligence. It is, I think, our Voltaire's garden, a local place of earth and heart, where as trustees of the future, we share with its fee simple owners responsibility to cultivate, because by doing so, we make ourselves and our community better. Thank you.
I look forward to joining you at the 2080 History Conference, and we'll just see how accurate your predictions are. We have time for a couple of questions. If anyone, there's a microphone right here.
My name is Tom Farquhar, and I have a small vegetable operation in Ashton, just outside of the agriculture. I just want to make an observation. I work closely with Jeremy Chris, the Director of Agriculture in the county. He supports us, as he supports all farmers. But I think folks here should know that probably less than 1% of the acreage in the Ag Reserve produces table food for county residents. So if there were policy possibilities in the future that could support raising that number, it would be good for the climate, good for the county, good for the nutrition of our citizens, and really good for the land and for the farmers. Thank you for what you've done.
Thank you, and you're quite right. I think there is a possibility. My expectation is that as agriculture has changed over the centuries, it will continue to change, and in part because the market for fresh local food is becoming so robust, I'm expecting that more and more acreage in the reserve will get devoted to that purpose.
Hi, I'm Jane Evans.
Hi, Jane.
Hi, Royce. I own a farm in the Ag Reserve and help advocate for agricultural things. But my question to you today, what avenues do you see that are possibilities for helping to better educate and have this more urban members of our county and residents have a deeper feeling for the kinds of things you've expressed today for the Ag Reserve? Because there seems to be an ongoing, we can't reach those more urban residents to really appreciate the value of it. So you do end up with some of the negative things being pushed out to the Ag Reserve. And I have lived through many of the things that you are talking about and have worked with that.
We first met.
So, you know, we feel we want to continue that. I live on a grain farm. Grain farmers want to do that as long as grain farmers are able to earn a living and do that. But you have to have the county policies, but you also have the residents to value it and not try to put solar farms in the Ag Reserve, which is one of the current topics. And so what I'm curious about is how do you reach those more urban residents whose lives really are not centered in the Ag Reserve?
That's
and
a
help
very
them with
that's a
that?
very good question. There are some things that are going on now that are very promising. The Montgomery County Society Alliance, working with Farm Bureau, now has developed a program in which there is a mobile system that goes around elementary schools to help kids understand that food doesn't just come from the grocery store. And that is now reaching a population that's very important because they're going to be the voters in the future in the county. So that's one thing. You can all help that by buying a farm tag for your automobile instead of just the standard Maryland license tag. One of the things that I mentioned in the talk that I think may also be helpful is the farmers markets have just really flowered in the county over the last several years. We sort of started the first one back in the 70s at Silver Spring at the old Armory. But they've just, almost every community now has one. One of the things that's still lacking in the county, I think, is a central farmers market. In other communities where I've lived, for instance, in the Minneapolis area and in Dallas, where I lived when I wasn't living in Montgomery County, large farmers markets are very important. They're an economic asset to the cities. And they also are a great educational resource for people, both in terms of nutrition and things like that, but also in making a connection so that people begin to get a sense that, this stuff's got to be coming from somewhere. And if you have active educational programs associated with the farmers market, which we're not able to do in the small individual ones that occur at the community level, which we want to keep doing, that can give us some possibilities that we don't otherwise have.
Okay. Thank you, Royce.
Thank you.
Thank you, Godfather. I'm Caroline Taylor. I work with a small nonprofit, Montgomery Countryside Alliance, and we've benefited for a number of years from being able to call Dr. Hanson when we're in need of counsel, in need of guidance, and so for that, I thank you. As to your point in terms of access to acreage for farming, and to the gentleman who brought up the amount of food that we grow here that ends up on our tables, I would like folks here to take the opportunity to learn more about our program LandLink, and if you have acreage that can be farmed, whether it's in the Ag Reserve or whether it's elsewhere in the county, please think about having it be put in sustainable, meaningful cultivation. Thank you, Royce.
Thank you, Caroline. And some of you may have seen in yesterday's Washington Post in the local news section, there was a very interesting piece on one of the farmers that has benefited from LandLink out near Brookville. Again, if there's not any more question, I thank you for not having any more questions. And thank you.